This meeting is being recorded, so that should have popped up on people's screens. So don't say anything that you don't want in the daily news. No, I'm not gonna say that. So I am gonna warm this up by telling my story of trouble. And I'm not a politician. This isn't a particularly political story, but I do want to talk about, I don't know if Helen is here yet, but Helen Gim has been a big education advocate. Is she here?
Yes.
Hi, Helen. And so I'm going to tell a story about my first year teaching. The statistics are not good. They say 50% of all teachers burn out in the first 5 years. And it's not because of low pay necessarily. And it's not that the kids are bad, I don't think. I think it's because there you are with all these kids and you have to figure out what to do. And my first year teaching, I was a science teacher. I was trying to make science exciting and I accidentally set a little boy on fire. So what happened was, it's okay to laugh, he's fine. What happened was, like, I had all the right theories that you had to make science engaging, but what I didn't have was, I didn't know how. So I was running through every hands-on science activity that I could think of, you know, getting the egg to go through the jar and making a little tornado in a bottle. And, you know, I was just running through every hands-on science activity I could think of. The problem was, by the third week, I was out of ideas and the kids were still there. So I told them they were the gifted class and they were supposed to invent their own experiments. These were 7th graders, and so they decided that they were going to make a spontaneous combustion chamber. And what they did was, we looked it up in Mr. Wizard's Science Secrets, but we didn't have all the equipment. Like if you're imagining a science lab with a fume hood and beakers, get that image out of your head. This was public education in the Reagan era. We had egg cartons and string and imagination. So the spontaneous combustion chamber, and I'm gonna ask you to do a little mental work here to envision what they did. We had a coffee can, drilled a hole in the side, stuck a rubber tube through the hole. You still with me? Coffee can, rubber tube. Inside the coffee can was a funnel that we put flour in the funnel, candle, lit the candle, put the lid on the coffee can. Now we didn't have a tight fitting lid. We actually just had some tin foil. And so lit the candle, put the lid on. Little Robert Rydell got elected to blow through the hose. And then what happened, what was supposed to happen was the flour, you know, ignites and the lid is a tightly sealed lid that pops off and makes a big noise and everybody gets to say yay. But what did happen was the tinfoil flew off, and I don't know if you remember what was going on with people's hair during the 80s. If you were white, you kind of sprayed it up like Bananarama. You remember that look? And if you were black, you relaxed it into these drippy little ringlets like Michael Jackson. My point is, people were flammable. So the lid pops off, the flame shoots out, and little Robert Rydell had a jerry curl, went up like a torch, I start screaming. It's actually a very low temperature flame. I looked it up later. The flash point of jerry curl solution is 68 degrees. So, I mean, it's a wonder we weren't all just sort of bursting into flames on the crisp autumn mornings. But so I smashed it out with my hands. You might think that the other kids would be concerned that their colleague was on fire, but that was not the case. I've seen the acronym rolling on the floor laughing, but this was the only time I actually saw people rolling on the floor laughing. And you might also think that I would have gotten in trouble, but I didn't, because the kids didn't tell anybody because they all wanted to do it again. Robert was fine. Turns out he wasn't actually on fire. It was really his hair. It was actually the chemicals on his hair that were on fire. He didn't even know he was on fire. He didn't know why I was slamming his head. So it was a funny story, but I want to get you emotionally prepared because the second fire of my first year of teaching was a little more serious. And what happened was, I got called into the principal's office and she asked me, did I want to take the 7th graders on a week-long field trip to an archaeological dig site in Southern Illinois? Because by this time she'd heard they were the gifted class. So I said, of course I do, let's go. We were in Chicago and I was going to take all the 7th graders down to Southern Illinois. And I know you guys are from the Midwest, so you might not know that Southern Illinois is closer geographically, linguistically, politically, it's closer to northern Mississippi than it is to Chicago. It's very southern. These were all African-American kids. We took the train down. They put us in a little cabin on kind of the outskirts of town where there was a Center for American Archaeology, and the kids were going to actually get to work on a dig site, and everybody was excited, and they're all playing with their Rubik's cubes and listening to Rock Lobster and having a great time until, I got them all to sleep. And then in the morning, we opened the door and someone had burned a cross on our lawn. So we were terrified. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't want to leave the cabin. Finally, the archaeologist came to look for us. He saw the cross. He saw what was happening. He went and got the mayor. The mayor came to talk to us and said, listen, sorry this happened. This was just a prank. I was like, prank, hate crime, fine line. The kids were scared, but the mayor said he was going to do an investigation. And I'm like, investigation? There's like 300 people in this town. Like, can't you just ask around? Like, I don't think you need to call in Mr. Tibbs. In any case, we all went down to the dig site and we started working on the project, but the kids were very jumpy. As you can imagine, most of them had never been away from home before. There's Black kids in a white town in Southern Illinois. There's been a cross burned. They were terrified. So every time they heard a noise, they're running and they're clinging to me, and they just weren't getting a lot out of the archaeology. And we kind of got through the day. By the second day, they were still very jumpy. And I thought, you know what? I'm not dealing with this. I am not going to deal with this. And it was a little tough my first year teaching. I didn't know how to walk that tightrope between really respecting the power of that image and how terrifying it is, but not wanting to ruin this field trip that we'd done so many bake sales to get us down there. So I got the kids in a room and I wasn't sure what I was going to say. And I finally said, who here is ready to rise above their fear? And I waited. And finally, little girl, Melanie McLean, raised her hand. And then, if Melanie raises her hand, of course, Tiffany's going to raise her hand. And then all the little girls, I'll wrap it up. We're almost done. All the little girls raise their hand, then all the little boys raise their hand. And so I said to them, we're going to walk down to the center of town and we're going to get breakfast and we're not going to let ourselves be afraid. And we start walking through the town and it started to drizzle. And this little girl, Melanie, where she got her leadership skills, I don't know. She started to sing. When you walk through a crowd, hold your head up high. Through a storm. And they all knew this song from an assembly the previous year, and they all joined in. And the people in the town came out of their houses and they did the slow clap as the kids walked by. And that's when I knew that they were the gifted class. And that's when I knew that I wasn't going to burn out. So thank you. Thank you. That is my trouble story. Thank you so much. And coming up, we have a woman who is famous for her education advocacy. Are you here, Helen? Hello. It's so nice to see you. You are on, oh good, you're off mute. And did you come prepared to tell a story about a time you made trouble or were in trouble or saw trouble?
I will do my best to follow up on your very beautiful story, Marjorie, and thank you so much for opening it. And it's such a pleasure to join the Neighborhood Network's family and community. Of course, I wish we were in person because it would be so wonderful to see everybody. But things being the way they are, it's also great just to see everybody's faces and to know that on this MLK Day, we are recommitting ourselves. And I appreciate that Marjorie dropped the word good from trouble. I was going to open up by saying that when it comes to causes of justice, I don't necessarily believe in qualifying trouble with good. I'm very thoughtful about King's words from Letter from a Birmingham Jail about those who, I mean, obviously you condemn those who commit immoral actions for immoral ends. But there are also those right now who take moral action for immoral ends. And in those cases, they are backed up by laws that are on the books that protect illegal gerrymandering, unconstitutional funding of our schools, the horrible deportation and massive detention of immigrants that continues to go on right now. And so, for us, an unjust law is no law at all. And on those cases, then, oftentimes we have to drop the good from the trouble and recognize that part of the work of King's legacy and waking us up out of our almost, complacency and our fear that things will never change is the idea of those who go to great risks to do so. So I'll tell you a very brief story about probably something that was more transformative for me than it was like a radical moment, but very transformative for me. And that was 20 years ago. Philadelphia Chinatown faced the announcement by then a brand new mayor of a baseball stadium in the middle of its community. And it would have been $1 billion in public money at a time when, of course, then, as is now, we could literally count any million number of places that we could put, or a billion number of places where we could put $1 billion worth of public money. And one of them was not a baseball stadium in the middle of downtown Philadelphia, in the heart of Chinatown, where a community was struggling for visibility and voice. In the announcement of the baseball stadium, one of the things that was said was that this was an ideal location because there were no residents who lived there. And of course, it meant that it was the ongoing erasure of immigrant communities, one of the last communities of color in downtown. And we were determined back then to raise our voices. Now, 20 plus years ago, back in 2001, I was a pretty newly minted person. This was probably my first time doing a big event and a big protest. I remember thinking everybody's lined up against us. We've got Major League Baseball against us. We've got the new mayor against us. We've got all of City Council against us. And who do we have on our side? On our side, we had many people who are immigrants, many who didn't speak English, people who had a long time history in a neighborhood and community that had not been recognized as such, and who were determined nonetheless to fight, to bring voice to this cause, and ultimately to speak for not just themselves, not just the community, but for Philadelphia. And one of our biggest actions was I remembered in August, I think it was, we did a general strike of Chinatown. This was the first time that we had organized all the businesses to actually shut down. So it was and we had signs in place that this business was closed to oppose the stadium. The general strike was pretty phenomenal because we had so many different businesses and all the restaurants agreed to shut down in the middle of the day. And then we took to the streets. I remember thinking back then that I had a nagging sense of doubt. I was wondering, like, why were we pushing so hard? The forces against us were so great, and did we have any chance to win? And then in a rally, we had, I was fortunate to be part of an organization like Asian Americans United that had just a tremendous history of people who had fought many different battles. They had been on the front lines of anti-apartheid. They had been part of the civil rights movement. They had fought no nukes. They had fought Reagan. They had fought, and any number of people in between. And so, being outnumbered, difficult odds was just part of this was not unusual. But for me, I remembered being really doubtful. But then I remembered this moment when one of my mentors, and some of you may know Debbie Way, but she kind of rose up with her fist in the air. And I remembered these banners streaming behind her and all these people in Chinatown. And she gave a speech in English and Chinese, and I felt like she was a warrior out of a mythical fable, like giving you voice and saying, like, this is our community, we will not back down, and we will be remembered not for being silent, but for fighting this until the end. And I remember thinking, oh my God, just charge, let's go. And we then took to the streets. And actually what we did was we shut down 676. We got onto the highway. We actually laid down and we sat there for, I don't know, I think it was at least 45 minutes. We gave speeches from there. And, to us, it wasn't at the time like a thinking about whether it was trouble, good trouble. We knew that we had to disrupt the order of things, the predictability, the feeling that nothing would ever change, the notions of who held power in any given moment. And of course, as many of you know, there is no baseball stadium in the middle of Chinatown. And in fact, on the footprint of that stadium is a school that we ultimately founded. There is, hopefully the beginnings of that, a green trail. There are discussions of, community and family, and a city that we can all believe in. And it's not lost on me that some 20 years later, Black and brown activists took to 676 with the same feeling that these things cannot be left unsaid, that silence is death, and that, that our voices had to stand true. And I'm sure that for many of them, because some of my own children were in that they were, this was a moment of transformation that, like me 20 years ago, I felt transformed by a moment that felt impossible and hopeless. And I was buoyed up, lifted up, and inspired by people who refused to accept that things had to be the way they are. But in this particular case, these individuals were surrounded by our police department. They were tear gassed. They were beaten. We all witnessed it in the streets. And it is something that, again, shocks us out of our complacency, wakes us up, and reminds us that these moments of transformation, in our particular case 21 years ago, partly why I dropped the word good from trouble, because we weren't surrounded by police, we weren't beaten, we weren't tear gassed, and I don't know if we were thought of as good trouble. I kind of think that we weren't, because we got shunned by the administration forever. But I want us to think that 20 years later, when activists did the same thing to demand that a city wake up, that we cannot abide by the inhumanity of the way that things are, that they were seen as dangerous, as criminal elements, as people that had to be silenced and beaten and gassed in horrible, horrible ways, in violent ways. And so, I say all of that to just reinforce that we want and of course uphold the belief of what John Lewis did. But what John Lewis did in 1960s was not considered good. It was just considered trouble.
Thank you
And
so much, Helen. That's
similarly, yeah, that's where we are today too.
such
So
an
thank you,
inspiring
everybody.
story. And I will always remember there is no baseball stadium in Chinatown. And just remembering that when we stick together, we win. And thank you so much for your inspiring story. And I forgot to introduce you as council member Helen Gim. And when people hear your name, the adjective I hear most often is fearless. And now I see why it's transformative. And I just really thank you. I forgot to mention some of the logistics that we have a lot of speakers, and when you get to about 7 minutes, Margaret's going to play a little sound, and that's going to be wrap it up. So we're not trying to be rude, but we have more people. But thank you so much for starting us off. That was a beautiful story. I'm so glad that we heard you. Our next storyteller is also not a politician, but he has won how many, I don't know, story slams and grand slams from First Person Arts. He's a wonderful storyteller and an entertainer. Hi, Steve. You got a story for us today?
Yeah, how you doing? Hello there.
You know, at 5 minutes, I'm gonna start slapping you, right?
What?
At 5 minutes, we're gonna start playing that song. Because I went over and everybody's yelling at me at text.
No worries. I got you. Yeah, let's keep it on point. I don't think I'm gonna go that long. So no worries. But so I would say in my line of work, what I do for a living, I'm not only an educator, I'm also a therapist, a psychologist, a coach, even a father figure. And so as a part-time Grubhub delivery driver, I have found a lot of meaning in that work. No, but there's one. I'm just kidding, obviously, but I have been doing that to make ends meet. There's one common enemy that I face a lot, that I know a lot of people in the Philadelphia area also face, and I've tried to come up with ways to confront them, and I would like to end them. And that enemy is the Philadelphia Parking Authority. They are a godless organization who is tyrannical, and I think that it's our responsibility as Philadelphians. In Philadelphia, we hate tyranny and we love sandwiches. And sometimes when we park to get sandwiches, we face the tyranny of the Philadelphia Parking Authority. And I think that's a big problem. Who runs them? Is it the city? Is it the state? Is it a private company? Nobody knows. And I think it's our job to shut them down. So I'm going to tell you a couple strategies that I've come up with for shutting them down. The first one is, how you print out those tickets and you put them on your window? Well, what I do is I try to save them, and then I spread them all out on my dashboard. So every time I have to print a new one, I just print it out and put it on there. So they have to look for the new one every time. I think it makes sense. Takes up their time, keeps them from charging other people, and that's the other thing about the PPA is I think a lot of their business model is targeting poor people who can't afford them. So they tow their cars, they sell their cars. Yeah. Okay. So the second thing that I've done, and I don't know if anybody has any free time, maybe we'll get another stimulus check. One thing I did a couple of years ago is I applied to work for the PPA. And so literally I applied for one of their jobs. And my plan was to get some insider info, but then also to just walk around until, not ticketing anyone on my beat until they let me go. And it hasn't worked out. They haven't gotten back to me. They may have heard about me. I'm not sure. Still waiting on that application. I know that, like, it seems like places are desperate these days for people to work. So maybe they will get back to me. I don't know. Third thing I do is if I see a PPA ticket person on the street, I try to stop them and talk to them, take up as much of their time as possible, so that time that they're talking to me is not time that they're ticketing other people. You know, it's partially effective, but you know, I think it works. I think if we all contribute to that, we all could take up some of their time, talk to them, engage them for a couple minutes every day. That's a couple of tickets that they're not writing. But the last thing I want to tell you that I've done, and the thing that I think is most successful, kind of ridiculously, is I've started a social media account where I take and I accept submissions of pictures of illegally parked PPA cars. So what I do is I get pictures of their cars where they're parked illegally, and I post them online. And so the account is pics of PPA cars parked illegally. And I use that account to post those to kind of push. And, you know, I don't know if it's making a difference, but it certainly is highlighting the hypocrisy of the Philadelphia Parking Authority. And I know that, you know, our last speaker recently addressed this issue. Recently, the PPA came out and said they gave the school district too much money, but they can't prove it. Like, what close this organization. I'm not saying we don't need parking regulation. I'm saying we need it done by our own citizens, by our own people, not this monstrous organization. And that's about all I have, Marjorie. Thanks so much for having me.
Steve, thank you so much. You are just a troublemaker as you go through your day. And it's not like, but I just want to emphasize, everyone, please do what Steve does. Talk to PPA people and waste their time. What a wonderful way to protest, by wasting people's time. I like
Amen.
it.
Amen.
I shall be doing that from now on. And we hate authority and we love sandwiches. That should be our motto, as opposed to City of Brotherly Love, which means nothing. So
Absolutely.
I want to thank you so much for coming, Steve. You know I love you, right?
Sure. I love you too, Marjorie. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Well, it is time for an audience member to tell a story of a time they made trouble. So please welcome Carol Metzger. Yay! Hi, Carol. Unmute. You're on mute.
Okay, so this is a silly story. I was 4. It was 1956. Martin Luther King was in Chicago. He spoke at the University of Chicago, and I think we walked downtown. I remember being on my father's shoulders, and the march was chanting, "What do you want? Freedom. When do you want it? Now." I was 4. I was chanting, "What do you want? A drink of water. When do you want it? Now." I had absolutely no political awareness whatsoever. This changed. I grew up. I studied. I'm what they call a red diaper baby. That's somebody with a communist parent. I've been an activist since birth. I just didn't know it. So between then and now, I've done some more significant troublemaking, but that was probably the first one I remember. That's it. I'm done. It's a short story.
Thank you, Carol, for that story. And what do you want? A drink of water. I get it. Bo, I think you're up next. Bo? Yeah, there you are. Bo, you're on mute.
Yes, and I will unmute myself. So I'd like to introduce Council Member at Large Derrick Green. I actually got a chance to meet Derrick years ago when a group of us, organized by one of our good friends, Neighborhood Network good friends, Steve Masters, got us into various council members' chambers in order to, I think we were lobbying for a resolution opposing citizens, the Supreme Court Citizens United judge, Supreme Court decision. And we met Derrick Green, who was Marion Tasco's chief of staff. And what surprised me, and I was kind of stunned by the scholarship. Not only was Derrick extremely busy as a city councilwoman's chief of staff, but he had this real scholarly penchant for reading through Robert Caro, the great journalist historian. So he had read about Moses, and I'm not talking about the Palestinian Moses. This is the New York Moses. They're both Jewish, but Moses, Robert Moses, the builder. And then he was working his way through a 3-volume biography of LBJ. Now, I made a mental note to myself to emulate that, except I lost that note. So I've been remiss now. And this is probably 8 or 9 years ago, Derrick, where you set a wonderful example, as busy as you were, and with your scholarship, and I haven't even begun to live up to it. Anyhow, you're a wonderful friend to Neighborhood Networks. People know you as prime mover of public banking in Philadelphia, which will be a game changer for the city and for minority businesses and for parents. And we'll rank there with the state of North Dakota, which has had a public bank for over 100 years, never lost a dollar in its 100 years of existence. We'll have the same thing. And Derrick, theme is getting is good trouble, bad trouble, any kind of trouble. So what have you got to say for yourself?
Well, Bo, thank you for the introduction. I did read all of those books and many other books, but I'm reflecting on Carol's story, and I'm thinking, what do we want? Aqua, what do we want it now? Is like a new chant I should remember when she talked about her story. But I just want to thank Neighbor Networks for having this conversation. I remember when we were, I think at that time on Germantown Avenue, it probably wasn't the North by Northwest at that time, but it was another establishment, and Margie was the MC, and we had an opportunity to share a story. And everything we learn in life is through some type of story. When you think, and well, you talked about Moses, so you think about the 10 Commandments, you think about the founding of this country, all the challenges we've had in this country come about by way of story. And so as I was thinking about tonight's kind of conversation and a story, we've been making good trouble with the Public Bank Initiative. Some of us were together when I actually had some hair working on predatory lending, so we're making good trouble there. And some of you have heard some of the story about my grandfather and how he was able to do some things in Pitt County, North Carolina, and helping to bring Black farmers together to create a transportation system for African-American youth at that time. But I often talked about what he did, but I didn't always give the full context of that story. So I'm gonna take a few moments to kind of take the full context of that story. So my grandfather, Walter Tillman Green, was born March 25th, 1888. And my great-great-grandfather, his grandfather, Amos Green, and he was transferred by way of a will from Richard Reynolds to Richard Green, Richard Reynolds' grandson. And that's actually where we got the Green name. And so after my grandfather's father, Willie, passed away, my grandfather became the father, kind of the adult of the house at that time. And, from that time period, from Craven County, where my great-great-grandfather was transferred by way of will, to Pitt County, my grandfather got involved in farming. And it was 1843 when that transfer occurred, when my family was transferred by way of a will to Richard Green. And so 1843 is an important year for me. And then fast forward, my grandfather, Walter Tillman Green, was able to get involved in farming. And then around 1938, he started to rent out our family farm, which he was then able to purchase in 1943. And so I've often talked about the context, but the context of 1843, when my forefathers were transferred by way of a will, to 1943, my grandfather was able to purchase our family farm, and we've been able to maintain that to this day. And there's and this is on Highway 118 in Grifton, North Carolina, in Pitt County. And my grandfather purchased that farm. And shortly after he purchased that farm, some men came to my grandfather's house late at night with guns. And basically they said that we're going to force you off this land. And my grandfather went to his bedroom, got his shotgun, and said, no, you're not. And we're very fortunate that something did not occur. There could have easily been a riot right there in Grifton, North Carolina, very similar to some of the riots you may have heard about in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Elaine, Arkansas, or Rosewood, Florida, or Colfax, Louisiana. And if that had occurred, I would not be here. So when I give that context of how my grandfather was able to bring African-American farmers together to be able to say, we're going to purchase a bus to enable our children to be able to not just work on the farm, but actually get transportation to South Aidan Pitt College School. He did that within the context of the fact that he was threatened off his very land. And it was always situations like that that happened to African Americans all around this country. So many times we don't hear about what happened in Tulsa, or what happened in Rosewood, or in Lane, Arkansas, or Colfax, Louisiana. So although I've been able to get in some good trouble by challenging some of the dynamics that have occurred historically in banking through working with so many of you, the fact that my grandfather laid this foundation of getting into what we would say is good trouble and be willing to purchase a farm in 1943, 100 years after his family was transferred by way of a will in slavery, and then be able to still stand up for him and his family to make sure that he and his children, other Black children in Pitt County, would be able to get a better education. It gives a little more context to some of the shoulders that I stand on, and gives me additional strength when I have some big interests that come to me and say, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. So I know I've given that story in the past, but I wanted to give a little more context to that story to give you a little perspective of some of my family history as it ties into good trouble. And other days, and maybe another time, another story session, I'll give you some perspective about good trouble of other members of my family. But no, this is all about story, and the fact that we've shared these type of stories is so important, so that other people will never forget what's happened in history, because we continue to control story and provide story to so many of us, so that the other generations can understand what happened before we got here. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to add, Derrick, that's a marker for you to live up to, isn't it? If you're fearful, you think about your ancestors, right?
Well, I have some issues with Second Amendment, so I'm not into the gun thing per se, because I think people have done some very weird readings of the Constitution under the Second Amendment. But him having that type of fortitude of always being willing to stand up for certain things in spite of odds, in spite of all the things that were going around in the country, especially in the South in 1943, and still willing to say, I'm going to do what needs to be done to help others. So it gives me a little inspiration to do some of the work that I do every day, working with so many great people in neighborhood networks who have their own inspiration from their own relatives and children and backgrounds that have helped us to get to this point in our country, even though we have so much more work to do.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you, Derrick.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Derrick. What a moving story. What a moving story. I had some technical difficulties, but thank goodness this is going to be recorded so I can listen again. But it's good to see you. And thank you so much for coming. We are going to have another story from an audience participant. Please welcome Toby Hoffman.
Hello, thank you. Thank you to our council members who are here telling amazing stories about successes. And what I realize is that we all know that music is really important to any movement. Any movement, music is really important. And how many people here were at the Washington, D.C. First Women's March? Raise your hand if you were at the
Me.
Washington First. Yeah, okay. So there was some problems that they thought there was gonna be violence, I think. And they said, don't bring anything. Don't bring any drums, don't bring any sticks, don't bring they were supposed to have checkpoints. I don't think they expected 1 million people there. There were no checkpoints, but there were also no drums. And I certainly was not anywhere near to the stage where there apparently was music. I heard it later when they played it again, but I didn't hear any. So nobody knew what to sing.
Mm.
Nobody knew what to sing. I had a sign that had the words to, we're gonna wash that man right out of my hair. We're gonna wash that man right out of our hair. That's the song I was singing, but there wasn't any songs that like people were singing together. And a lot of people noticed that when we all came back to Philadelphia. Jane Hulting, the magnificent former director of Anna Cruce's choir, the women's choir, she gathered a bunch of people together and said, we have to figure out what to sing now. We have to find songs that are relevant now. We have to find songs. And sure enough, 20, 30 people came and we found songs that are relevant now. We wrote our own songs. It was pretty amazing. What I realized is that people didn't really understand the value of music in protests and rallies. Something had gotten lost over the years, and we had to kind of push our way in and say, you got to have more than just a song at the beginning. You got to have songs all the way through. You got to have music, and you have to get people to sing music with you. That's the kind of music that people really relate to singing together. So I'm going to do that with you folks. But I also want to say, I see some of the voice in the group that was formed is called Voices Rising Philly. And now people actually ask us to sing. So if you're part of that group, I see some people here that are, yeah, look at that. Bruce and Linda, that's great. And Sharon and a bunch of people here are part of that group. Yeah, so I'm going to sing a song. How about that? Actually, this was written quite a while ago. It was kind of this time of year because it was the playoffs, the football playoffs were going on. And so there was this big hype about the Super Bowl. I'm not a football fan. Oops. Sorry. Until the Eagles won, I wasn't a football fan. But I had this phrase came into my mind, which was, freedom is not a spectator sport. So this is what came. And so this is a part you can sing. Now, I know, we can't really hear each other. Although, if you're really brave, my friends in Voices Rising Philly, and you want to sing the echo part, we're getting to get into good trouble here. and I invite you to do that. So it goes like this. If I, freedom, and then you go, freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom's not a spectator sport, no sister. Freedom's not a spectator sport. Now, if you're not a singer, you can always clap, right? That's the idea here. We're going to clap together. Now, I know even clapping on Zoom is weird because you're clapping after I'm singing, but you can do something. Freedom, freedom, freedom's not a spectator sport, no brother. Freedom's not a spectator sport. Well, Martin Luther King is a hero of mine, and he had a little help along the way. Oh, there were tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, people to march with him, and when they marched for freedom, This is what they had to say. Oh, freedom, 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 freedom. Freedom's not a spectator sport, no, sister. Freedom's not a spectator sport. Well, I think we have some new heroes. I think I'm going to say Stacey Abrams is a hero of mine, and she's got a little help along the way. She needs a lot of help. Tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, people beside her. And when she marched for voting, oh, this is what she had to say. Freedom, freedom, freedom's not a spectator sport. Keep last one. Freedom's not a spectator sport. So anytime you have a rally or a march, you can call me, you can call Bruce and Linda Pollock Johnson, and we will sing for you. We have songs for every occasion.
Go, Toby.
Thank you, Toby. Bo, it's on you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Toby. And I'd like to introduce our next speaker coming up, which is who is Council Member at Large Kendra Brooks. So I had the pleasure of meeting Kendra in August 2017, because you see that Neighborhood Networks partnered with Progressive Democrats of America and met with Dwight Evans's local staff on Ogons Avenue. And the two young people in the second row back right are the staff members. You see front right, Gloria Gilman, way to the right, Margaret, of course, you notice in the middle. We were advocating for the People's Platform so that Congressman Evans would vote the right way on 10 separate bills, I believe. And in the middle back row, our very stalwart grassroots steering committee member, Tanya T-Ba, who has been just wonderful for us in keeping us grounded as to what's happening in the streets and in the neighborhood in Germantown. And way to the left is Kendra Brooks, who came to the meeting and represented the People's Platform. And the ultimate upshot was that Congressman Evans did okay compared to a lot of other Democrats. There were 10 pieces of legislation, and I think he was on 5 or 6 of them, which was better than a lot. He wasn't on all 10. But so I had I love this photo because it's Neighborhood Networks doing you might call it the inside-outside strategy. Kendra is part of the inside strategy of getting grassroots activists in government, and we backed her. I knocked on 4 turfs, covered 4 turfs for her. Neighborhood Networks was big into getting her and Nick O'Rourke elected back in the day. Kendra succeeded. And the outside strategy is getting government to pass the right legislation. So we embrace the sort of inside-outside strategy. So Kendra, I won't take up, also one of the favorite photos is with you and me campaigning together electioneering when you were on election day, when you became city council member at large. Kendra, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure you've gotten in trouble in the past.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bo. I looked at that picture and I was like, man, these politics done beat me up. I look like a young girl back then. When I think of good trouble, I think I'm gonna go back a little bit like my colleague, Derrick Green, and I'm gonna just say some words that I remember growing up on my report card or from, elders in the community, that I was brazen, talkative, precocious, sassy, grown. These are the things that were told to me as a young girl because I've always spoke my mind. I wouldn't back down, which got me in a lot of trouble most of my life. But it took me being an adult to realize it was always good trouble. It wasn't because I was doing something wrong. I usually was standing up for someone else or myself in a way that people didn't expect, you know, this little small Black girl to just always have something to say about everything. And I use that as part of my story because that, for me, is what paved the way for all the good trouble that I got into. But I want to talk about one of the most memorable moments for me, because it included my kids. We had taken time off. I took a day off to protest Kavanaugh. And I remember running through the Senate Hall and Senate chambers with my daughters in tow, trying to get them to vote him down, with some friends and colleagues, you know, cheering on my friends getting arrested, allowing my children to see that for the first time, and having to explain to them what was happening, why we were doing it, and what made it important. And the reason I picked that story, because by the time my children, my daughters at that time, one had to be as young as 7, the other one maybe like 11. They said, Mom, you get arrested too. We'll be all right. So they were pushing me to get arrested with some of my friends. But I was like, if I get arrested here, I'm getting arrested when we get back in Philly too, because who's going to take you guys back home? And the reason that's a story of good trouble, because it set a precedent in my family to stand up and fight no matter what, whether it's local, whether it's federal, and don't be afraid to share your story. So for me, that story is so significant because it kind of was in the mix of all the other fights, whether it was the fight for Steele School against Mastery, which was a fight that I won that I didn't think I was going to win, whether it was organizing some of those same parents that were silenced to fight against the School Reform Commission that continued to make bad policy and legislation that affected people in our community, all the way down to just being elected and pissing off the Democratic Party just because. You know, when someone runs on something different and is willing to speak up about the status quo, you're making trouble, right? But really, you're just making change. So, you know, it's hard for me to classify good trouble because I feel like I've been getting in trouble my entire life. That's why it was important for me to share those words, because these are the words that I heard every day, whether from my grandparents, whether I was in church. I got in trouble a lot in church. Isaiah probably remembers that. Or in school. So it's just like good trouble has been a definition of just standing up for what's right and making sure that not only your voice is heard, but you're helping other folks making sure their voices are heard. So, you know, I started with my story, led it to the story with my children, and ended it with the power behind that quote unquote good trouble.
Thank you.
So, well, one quick question. Where do you think the courage came from? You as a little girl, in church, at home, at school, where did that come from?
I come from a family of very strong, independent women, which probably sometimes came to kick them in the butt. But I think that my grandmother was a fighter and my mother was a fighter, and they spoke very openly about what's right and wrong. And I think the courage just came from what was instilled in me. Even though sometimes I would get in trouble for doing the right thing, it was, you know, it's just a different time now, you know, a different time and a different era. I come from the era you speak when spoken to. Yeah. And young kids don't talk out of place. Those are the things that would get me in trouble. But I think it just came from my family. My family still talk very openly about most issues, which gives young people a braveness and a boldness just to speak their mind.
Tremendous. Yeah.
So much, Kendra. I wrote down making trouble equals making change. That is something I'm going to remember that you said tonight. Thank you so much for your story. We have another guest coming up, and I want to say needs no introduction. Hello, Larry. How are you? He is our district attorney. Is that your title? I should know that.
At the moment,
And,
yes, indeed.
I just want to say, before you jump into your remarks, that you are a controversial figure. How do you stand in that wind tunnel and stand your ground?
Well, I have a really good political advisor who I have with me right now, this one.
Oh,
And as long as I stick to that advice, I do fine. It all works out.
so tell us about a time. Tell us about a time you made trouble.
I will. And first of all, delighted to be here. But I will try to respect your time because I know you're probably running a little late. So Heeding God's Call. Heeding God's Call is an organization some of you may know.
Yeah.
It is an organization of people of faith who, much like Councilmember Green stated, think there have been some very weird interpretations of the Second Amendment in the United States. And Heeding God's Call gave me the opportunity to get to know them because they all did a pretty good job at getting arrested. I was at that time a criminal defense attorney, a civil rights attorney. I had pursued a hobby of representing protesters and activists almost always for free when they got arrested in Philadelphia by the police and taken into the Philadelphia courts, and yes, indeed, prosecuted by the then district attorneys of Philadelphia, because that's what they used to do. When you tried to make the world a better place, they would lock you up in Philly. And by used to, I mean not so long ago. More specifically, what Heeding God's Call was up to is they knew that there was a very dirty gun shop at 10th and Spring Garden Street. It was called Colosimo's. Probably many of you remember it. And so they had gathered up some best practices. These were people of faith. They were clergy in many instances. The great Isaac Miller was one of them. And they would go to gun shops with these best practices, most of them taken from New York, something Bloomberg had been up to. And they would say, "Dear Mr. Gun Shop owner, it turns out you got a lot of guns that are popping up at crime scenes where people are killed, and there's some pretty strange paperwork here. Would you adopt these best practices?" Which had to do with things like how many guns you buy at one time and what kinds of identifications you require, right? So they went into the gun shop, and when the Mr. Colosimo did not want to play nice, they sat down and sang hymns. And what did the Philly police do? And what did the Philly DA's office do? They threw a book at him, because that's what you used to do. Now, this is after the 2006 mass shooting that had occurred in an Amish schoolhouse. It was known as Nickel Mines. I think there were 10 children shot, 5 died and 5 lived at that time. And it was before Colosimo's closed, because Colosimo's did close. The end of this story is that in a strange way, Colosimo's did close under pressure from the feds. Basically about 6 months after what I'm going to tell you about, the feds realized what a serious issue this was. Colosimo's was arguably the 5th dirtiest gun shop in the United States. There were an awful lot of guns that were going out the back door by mysterious means. And so it needed to be shut down. And the U.S. Attorney's Office, 6 months after what I'm going to tell you about happened, did succeed in shutting it down. So now you know the good part of the story. And the other thing that you might think is the most interesting part of this story is that, yes, they were arrested. Yes, I defended them. Yes, there was a trial, and they were all found not guilty. More good news. That's not my story. The story I want to tell you about is actually just a couple of details about that trial. Excuse my cat's tail. She's trying to participate. But what happened is I got to know these wonderful people like Isaac Miller, and they were not only singing hymns and doing a prayer meeting inside of Colosimo's when they were all locked up. They were actually doing it at the courthouse when they were getting ready to go to trial in front of a judge I know very well and respect quite a bit, the Honorable Karen Simmons of the Municipal Court of Philadelphia County. We were in one of the giant courtrooms because we expected such a huge turnout of people to support Heeding God's Call. They had, after all, mustered hundreds of people to come to the gun shop to express themselves. And so in this giant group, I looked over and I saw that there were a couple of benches with some school kids in it. I asked the court officer and found out that the judge's son was in attendance. He was about 10 years old, and the whole class had come to watch this, which I took as possibly an auspicious and positive sign, seeing as the judge might have invited that class to see many different things. So all 12 clergy, yes, it was 12, of course. What would you expect? But all 12 clergy were there doing their prayer meeting. The trial began, the trial proceeded. Isaac Miller testified about the necessity of improving what happened with gun distribution. That was the defense, that this was necessary and appropriate. And he was truly compelling. Another one of the clergy, Reverend McIntyre, got up and talked about nickel mines. He actually talked about how he had been a chaplain for the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia when many of the children who were shot at nickel mines in that schoolroom were actually brought, and his experience there. Trial was compelling from beginning to end, no thanks to me. These were compelling people. These were clergy who had spoken their whole lives. They were activists. They were amazing people. So we come to the end of the evidence, and the judge says, all right, I'm going to take about a half an hour, look over my notes. I will come back, and then I will tell you my verdict, guilty or not guilty. She got off the bench. She went in the back. Needless to say, I was not back there. But an attorney I knew was, and he told me this a little bit later. After all the clergy had testified, they had explained their religious and their good reasons for this. She was in the back going over her notes. And he went up to her and, he was friendly with her and said, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with this trial? And she looked up and said, and this is supposed to be the quote, she said, I'm not going to hell. She then came back in the courtroom, and as I said, she found everybody not guilty. Now, that is what I call heeding God's call, not just the 12, but also the judge. And it really does have a beautiful ending because Coliseumos was shut down for good. And I think largely as a result of the attention in the media that was attracted to it. Yes, I'm sure the feds were interested, but they got even more interested when it became such a public issue. You should know the fight in that community continues. There have been efforts to revive that gun shop. There is, in fact, a shooting gallery there, meaning a place where, or there have been at times, a place where you can fire your weapons. But thank goodness there is no gun shop there at this time. So, that is really not a story about me, but that is a story about some really, really good trouble and the wonderful results that came from it whenever we all heed God's call. And that's all I have.
Thank you.
You kept saying heeding God's call. I was thinking,
Thank you so much. It is heeding God's call. Are they still in existence? That group?
They are. They're still in existence. They do go to work all the time. One of the leaders is a guy named Brian Miller, B-R-Y-A-N. Miller, who used to run Ceasefire in New Jersey, I think, but is truly an expert at the ins and outs of how this country has been steamrolled by the gun industry and everything that it has, has brought us.
Thank you so much for that story. That image of singing hymns in this dirty gunshot is really going to stick with me. What an inspiring, and it goes back to what Toby was saying, that you need the songs. You need the songs to uplift us, because this is a struggle. And we uplift each other through songs, and we uplift each other through stories. And it is such a treat to be here. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Sure.
We have the next person coming up. I'm so thrilled. He offered to be here at the last minute. We said yes, yes, yes. He's my state senator and doing great work in Harrisburg. So please welcome Art Haywood. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you so much. And thank you, Neighborhood Networks, and everyone who's on. My story doesn't have such a tremendous ending as Larry's, but back in the winter of 2017, I was going to a breakfast with Reverend Kent Matthias, who's the pastor at the Unitarian Church on Germantown on Lincoln Drive. And then during the breakfast, we said, we've got to do something for MLK Day, which would have been MLK Day 2018. And we said, we don't want to do a day of service. We want to do a day of action. King was about action. So we sat around during breakfast and said, well, let's try to do something on raising the minimum wage, which was a cause for both of us. So the next week we got together and said, well, let's find a place where we can do an action that's close to the church on Lincoln Drive so that folks can go from the church to the action. So we selected the CVS on Lincoln and Mount Pleasant. So it was shortly after the King service events that would be at his church. So we said, okay, we're going to do an action at CVS to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So what's next? So we said, hey, I think that we should contact CVS and let them know what we're going to do. So I prepared a letter and an email and sent it to the CVS CEO, COO, CFO, social media person, told them we were demanding that they raise the wage to $15 an hour and inviting them to the protest that we had scheduled for MLK Day. Amazingly, about 48 hours later, we get a response from the CVS folks saying they want to meet. Now this is, January 15th is MLK Day. So they contact us on about the 11th. So they come to town, they meet in my Germantown office. It's me, Reverend Matthias, one of my staff persons, a lobbyist for CVS. I think it was 2 lobbyists for CVS and a VP. So we lay out what we're going to do. Then they ask a question. Why us? Since the minimum wage is $7.25. Reverend Matthias said, well, this is kind of like being on the highway. A lot of people are speeding, but you got the ticket. And so that was not probably the answer they were looking for. They did ask that we not do the event. They shared that they were not contemplating raising pay. We said, we're going to go forward, but you still are invited. On MLK Day of that January, it was about 20 degrees. It felt like 5. John Meyerson, Reverend Matthias, and many supporters came out. We protested, we sang. Yes, we did sing a song. And then we left. Now, what was interesting is about 3 weeks later, CVS made an announcement that they are raising the minimum wage to $11 an hour. Now, at that time, our demand was 12 now, 15 in a number of years. Unfortunately, that's still the demand for raising minimum wage in Pennsylvania. So we declared victory. Interestingly, the CVS said, no, not a victory. So in the context of protest, whether you get a victory that the folks acknowledge or not, it's all very much a cumulative process, because although CVS says they were not contemplating raising pay when they met with us, when they announced the pay raise, they said they were always thinking about raising the minimum wage. I'm sure that our effort was a small, probably a very small part of that outcome, but we were glad to put some public pressure, particularly social media pressure. And it was a lesson to all of us that social media pressure, which we use, can get the attention of big companies as they seek to protect their reputations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Art. And $7 to $11 is not a minor thing. So I'm so glad that they got picked for the speeding ticket. And of course, Kent is wonderful. I just love him. He's the best. So thank you so much. I think what's happening now, Margaret, were you going to introduce the next audience participator? You're on mute, Margaret. So I guess I
think you are.
Okay. Hi, David. How are you? We're going to have, just so you know, we have one more story from the audience, and then if people want to hang out and talk to each other, we can close the official program, but unmute people and have a little conversation among ourselves, because I know there's more stories, even if people didn't throw their name in the hat. And with that, take it away, David.
Well, my story is, it was told mostly by my dear friend, my dear friend, Larry Krasner. I was one of the 12 pastors. And it wasn't just pastors, it was a bunch of good Quaker people and good Church of the Brethren. All the peace churches had come together They had a big conference, and they decided that they were going to focus on gun violence in the city. And then they came to some of us that had this idea, and they said, well, we're going to do civil disobedience. Well, it turns out it was on, as Art said, it was on the coldest day of the year. It was on in February, and one day people sat in the gun store, and the next day, after those people got arrested, they locked the doors. They wouldn't let us in. So we just sat down in front of the door. And it was so cold, we just couldn't wait for them to arrest us. So so finally they took us away, they hauled us off, kept us overnight in jail. And then, we contacted Larry to take up the court case. We were so disappointed when we got arrested because there was hardly any coverage of it. Didn't seem like we did anything. Nothing seemed to happen. But 6 months later, Larry put us on the stand, and he had us tell the stories of all of us telling stories about the guys the pastors who had done funerals for people who'd been killed by gun violence. The clergy, the lay person who had a friend whose daughter was killed in a gun violence incident. And yeah, you better believe that judge wasn't going to find us guilty. And that was when we got coverage. That was when it got into the news. All those stories got told, and it did get to the government at that point. The ATF ended up, after many, many weeks of protesting, and people were out at the gun store week after week after week with signs saying, shut this place down. And finally, Coliseumos got closed. So thanks, Larry, for doing it. Thanks for getting us off. You made it happen. And it was a gift to the whole city. And with the struggle continues to go on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That sitting out in the cold, hoping to get arrested, that's a story for sure. Bo, you have some announcements, I understand.
Yes, thank you, Marjorie. And thank you for being a very gracious host and guiding us through the evening of storytelling. So I'd like to mention, and I just put this in the chat, and everybody here should be getting our Neighborhood Network's weekly email. So we had, and I put the link in the chat about a minute ago. If you look through it, it'll say neighbors, sign up for a general. Oh, Margaret did it too. Okay. So we're going to have a general membership meeting Saturday, January 29th at 3 p.m., also by Zoom. Ultimately, when we go through the Greek alphabet and they're out of virus variants, then we're going to be good. But I think we have another dozen or 18 letters. So, but ultimately we'll be meeting in person. So please sign up for that. About 90 minutes. We try to honor everybody's time, and we know it's Saturday. So it's a day off for a lot of folks. The other thing is that we just finished up a fundraising drive, but we're never done fundraising because we've expanded our outreach. And the heart of any organization is a sustaining membership. So when you get our next newsletter, look at the donate button. And if you can become a monthly sustainer, for example, $10 a month, $15 a month, $10 a month is something like 3 Starbucks coffees. And you really shouldn't be buying there because they're an anti-union shop, but you might be desperate and you've gone in there. So if you can become a sustaining member, I'm on the steering committee. I've been a sustaining member now for years. It's you don't notice it, and it goes to good effect. Or everybody that you've seen here are all volunteers, and we don't treat ourselves to elaborate lunches. When we used to meet in town, we brought our own dinners, and we ate around the conference table in an office building, the conference room donated to us. So we're very respectful of the money that's donated. We only use it when absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we would have met in the Bahamas, but we're not doing that. Anyhow, when you get the newsletter, consider becoming a sustaining member so that we can budget month by month and know what we can afford, because we have an important primary coming up in May or later. All right. Thanks for your attention. Margaret, were you going to say something? Marjorie, you were going to pick it up?
Just thank everybody for coming. If you would put in the chat if there were some things you heard that you want to remember forever. Waste the PPA's time by telling them pointless stories. I think that's a good tip. Making trouble is making change. There's no baseball stadium in Chinatown, and I'm not going to hell. There were just so many things that I heard today. And I think what we're doing, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of people don't want to be spotlighted, but if people can people can unmute themselves and talk to each other. We have a little time for that right now. So thank you for coming, everybody. This was a wonderful evening. I hope you all liked it as much as I did. That's it. Unmute yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, Bo.
Thanks, guys. And I put the contribute link in the chat if anybody wants to click on it now.
Chris Lundy, I don't remember him the last one.
I don't know.
Maybe he didn't make it tonight.
They told everybody.
Okay, I'm not hearing anybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It was wonderful.
This was so good. I'm putting it on gallery view. I want to see everybody's faces. Hello, everyone. And I guess we are going to.
It's Dr. Lisa.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Any further stories?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Marjorie and Bo for being such great co-hosts. You really kept the program moving. So
even though I went over my time, I had to finish my story. Sorry.
Everything was great. It was really great.
Story.
Okay. Well, that's it then. See you guys at the membership meeting.
Bye.
Great. January
Good night.
29th.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I should have said the thing.
Thanks.